So I was just kind of interested to hear you talk about, how you came to be at the place that you're at right now, and sort of what drove you to pursue economics as a whole.
It was a long, winding, twisting road. I actually started in a seminary program when I was out of high school, so I did that for 7 years. That didn't work out, for better or for worse. And then I was just trying to decide, okay, where on earth do I go from here?
Yeah.
And it really just came down to what I thought came easiest to me, and that was economics. So that's what I decided to pursue.
Very good, very good. So talking about the actual economy, what are some key, indicators that maybe the average person can sort of look at to get an indication of how the economy is doing at the current moment?
Cameron, so it's a great question, and one of the reasons why it's such a good question today is the fact that so many of the different measures that we have traditionally relied on to answer exactly that question have really failed us today. So I wrote a study with a co-author, Peter St. Ange, another econ PhD, and what we did is we looked at different measures of inflation, and we asked ourselves, why is it that people, when we ask them in polling how they feel about inflation, about the economy, the responses are way, way worse than any of the official data are telling us. And we approached it from the idea of, well, maybe the polls are right and the data are wrong. And so as we delved into how are these measures actually computed, we found that there are a lot of problems. In other words, there are assumptions that are made that made sense before, let's say before the pandemic, but just don't make any sense today. Housing is a really good example of that. If you look at how much does it cost today to afford the median price home, that monthly mortgage payment that you need for that home has doubled compared to the start of 2021. But if we look at the official inflation metrics, the increase is only about 22%.
Okay.
So you're off by almost a factor of 5.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that's incredible. And again, it helps answer that question of why is it people feel so much worse about the economy than the official numbers are actually telling us. So ironically, one of the best measures for how the economy is doing today is not objective data, but subjective data.
Right.
In other words, going back to those polls and asking people, how do you feel about your finances? Normally, feelings would be a terrible way to try to assess something like an economy. So I rely very heavily now on polling data, but I also use some other metrics, like I look at how much can people actually afford today. Right? What can fit in the typical American family's monthly budget compared to 3, 4, even 5 years ago?
Okay.
And sadly, the answer to that is less. Right? People can afford less today than they could back then.
Right.
Now, some of the official data that you can rely on, because it's rock solid and there's just no room for interpretation, there's no room for assumptions, are things like credit card data. So we have well over $1 trillion of credit card debt in this country right now. It has absolutely exploded. You can also look at how much are people paying in interest on those credit cards a year. It's well over $300 billion. And that's obscene, but that's where we're at today. That deadly combination of high debt loads and high interest rates. And so you start putting these pieces together, and you get, unfortunately, a very grim picture right now for a lot of American families, particularly those in the bottom half of that income distribution.
Yeah, okay. When you just talk about how, there's a big difference between what you normally look at and what you're now having to look at to see how the economy is doing, how do you sort of do that? How do you differentiate between the factors that you used to be using versus the ones that you have to use now?
One of the things that we have to rely on is private data. So you can look at the housing data, for example. You can look at private companies like Zillow, like Redfin. You can look at not even those companies, but let's say associations like the National Association of Realtors, NAR. So we have all kinds of data that we can get from private sources as opposed to just relying on, let's say, the Census Bureau or the Bureau of Labor Statistics, Bureau of Economic Analysis. And again, when we're just looking at the raw data and we're not trying to make assumptions and fill in the gaps, that's where we seem to be getting a much clearer picture of where things actually are today.
Okay, interesting. All right. So you're here to talk about, the election and the economic implications of the election. So to sort of speak about the election, how do you think, the recent election, is it going to have any long-term implications on the United States labor market, but more in particular like wages and employment rates?
Absolutely, I think all of those. in terms of the labor market, one of the things we've seen over the last 4 years has been a huge influx of foreign labor into the country. In fact, interestingly, there are actually fewer native-born Americans with jobs today than there were 5 years ago in 2019. So native-born Americans have actually lost ground over the last 5 years. So literally all of the net job growth we have seen during that time has all been foreign workers. And that has essentially come about by the fact that we have more or less an open border. And interestingly, this administration's own statisticians admit it's on literally every single monthly press release for the jobs report. They say that this category of foreign-born workers contains an unknown number of illegal aliens. So why is all this important? Well, the labor market's a market, right? It's right there in the name. Yeah. It's a market. Yeah. There is competition in that marketplace. And as you increase competition, what do? Well, you drive down price. Yeah. In the labor market, the price is what we call wages. So what's happening is you've increased the quantity of labor, you've dropped wage growth, but you're not increasing all kinds of labor, right? There's not a whole lot of graduate students, for example, coming across that southern border. There's not a lot of doctors, lawyers, etc. So those are the parts of the labor market that have basically been unaffected. Yeah. What we've seen the biggest increase in has been low-skilled labor. And one of the reasons why that's so detrimental for Americans broadly, doesn't matter who you are, is the fact that almost everyone begins their career as low-skilled labor. Right? Your first job is your first job because you haven't had any jobs before. Right. And that means you haven't had that chance to acquire skills. Right? You don't know how to show up on time, how to deal with a boss or coworkers or angry customers, right? You get your primary means of compensation actually in your first job isn't even money. Right. It's that skill set. Yeah. And so by cutting out that first rung on the ladder for, again, Americans across the socioeconomic spectrum, you've done a tremendous disservice, I think, to a lot of those native-born Americans, and it helps explain why they have so severely lagged behind in terms of the number of jobs.
Right, okay. So do you intend to see under the next administration, sort of a difference or any economic differences with the unskilled, workers that are coming across the border?
I think so. I think there's going to be a big shift in emphasis away from that low-skilled labor and to high-skilled labor. So I think there's going to be a big push to essentially import more high skills. So again, you're talking doctors, lawyers, all kinds of masters, PhD students. We need engineers, you name it. Very heavy on the STEM fields has been the talk from the incoming administration, the kinds of labor that they want to attract into the country. Now, interestingly, the same effect that you saw on the low end of the labor spectrum, where it's depressed wage growth, it will have the same effect on those other professions, right? But those are also the professions that we are in the most need of in this country and in our current economy. So I would expect to see slower wage growth for high-skilled labor, but I would expect to see much faster wage growth for the low-skilled labor.
Absolutely. So when you were talking about the immigration, Donald Trump has a sort of restrictive policy on immigration, and you were just talking about how he's going to have more of the high-skilled workers rather than the low-skilled workers. Currently, those low-skilled workers are mostly in a lot of our very important industries like agriculture. How do you think a Trump second term would affect those industries that rely on underskilled workers that are coming across the border?
Well, one of the interesting things, again, looking at what we've seen in terms of where we've added jobs over the last 5 years, when essentially native-born employment just stopped growing, when it completely flatlined, and foreign-born employment just continued skyrocketing, we haven't seen the explosion in things like agriculture. Right? We have seen a big increase in leisure and hospitality, but virtually all of those are simply replacing the jobs that were lost in 2020. So again, it's not a lot of, it doesn't quite fit the stereotypes of where you would expect a lot of this low-skilled labor, I should say the industries where you'd expect a lot of this low-skilled labor to be coming from. The other thing to remember is that we kind of fall into this mental trap of thinking, well, if this foreign-born labor isn't here to do the work, it just won't get done. There's literally over 5 million American men sitting on the sidelines today compared to before the pandemic. There is a tremendous amount of potential within the American labor market that just, unfortunately, again, has been sidelined, but can, again, be unleashed.
Okay. continuing to go with, President Trump, he just won the 2024 election, obviously. And what do you think his administration can, sort of expect over the next 4 years, but more specifically, within the first couple months in January once he gets inaugurated? What can that administration expect with the economy overall?
I think you'll see a lot of executive orders that are mostly undoing previous executive orders. For the most part, anything done by an executive order can be undone by another one. Now, sometimes you do get into all kinds of complications there that make it very difficult to simply undo an executive order, and sometimes it ends up requiring legislation. But by and large, I think you'll, again, see a lot of EOs that are undoing previous EOs from the current administration. I think you're going to see a huge push with DOGE to really delve into the budget, to go line by line, and to get rid of departments, agencies, bureaus, you name it. Not just trim the fat. I mean, take a chainsaw to the budget and really, really start getting rid of stuff. One of the big problems in Washington is the fact that there are so many sacred cows, and this is right and left. Republicans talk about, oh no, we can't cut defense spending, it'd be terrible. What do you mean? The Pentagon is spending $10,000 on things like screwdrivers. I mean, they've never passed an audit, ever. The Department of Education, same thing with them. They haven't passed an audit, I think, in like 3 years. So you have both on the left and the right, both Republicans and Democrats, all kinds of things that they consider sacrosanct that simply can't be considered as such anymore. There is waste, fraud, and abuse in the Pentagon just as much as there is in entitlements. And somebody needs to go in there, and this is where I'm so grateful to Elon and to Vivek. Somebody needs to go in there and really go line by line and just tear these things apart and get rid of any kind of illegitimate payment. Doesn't matter if it's to a defense contractor or somebody committing Social Security fraud.
How do you think changes in the regulatory policies will affect certain sectors such as tech, healthcare, and finance?
Cameron, this is a really good question. When President Trump has gone around and talked to business leaders in this interim between his two terms, he has routinely asked them, what was more helpful to you as a business leader? Was it the tax reform or the regulatory reform? Every single one of them said the regulatory reform. We forget there's a tremendous regulatory burden in this country. During the first Trump administration, for example, the regulatory reform that they did, even though they added some regulations, they repealed others, it ended up saving the average American family about $2,500 per year. Conversely, under the Biden administration, they've done exactly the opposite. They've added about $10,000 worth of regulatory burden on average per family. And so if you can once again go back to that regulatory reform mindset, you will do tremendous good for the economy, particularly for the manufacturing sector. People don't realize that, let's say a typical manufacturing worker makes in the ballpark of $50,000, right, when they're first getting into the field. The employer is paying another $50,000 or so a lot of times for benefits, particularly if it's a unionized situation. But the employer is also paying about another $50,000 in regulatory costs. And so you wonder, why can't the American worker compete anymore with his foreign counterpart, despite the fact that the American worker has 3 times as much capital at his disposal as his competition in China does? It's because, in large part, of this regulatory burden. So not only is the employer paying the wages or salary, they have that benefit burden and the regulatory burden on top of it, and that's why we've seen such a shift in production overseas. So again, if you can roll back that regulatory burden, be an absolute boon to the economy.
So in 2020, COVID played a huge role under the last couple months of the Trump administration. And what lessons do you think, the Trump administration can take from what they had to deal with when COVID hit and take those lessons into, maybe not something as severe, but a major economic blast, a shock?
I think probably the biggest lesson, and it sounds like the president has learned it, hopefully he has, I think he has, but we'll see. I think the biggest lesson for President Trump was figuring out who he could trust and who he couldn't. What's a good example? Steve Mnuchin, the former Treasury Secretary, essentially stabbed the president in the back. They had a plan that they were going to be able to get through Congress that would have essentially eliminated payroll taxes for the rest of the year. And so all these people who were afraid to go back to work all of a sudden had a huge incentive.
Yeah.
And businesses also had a huge incentive because let's not forget, I as a worker pay payroll tax, but then as you know, Cameron, the business is also paying their portion of that payroll tax as well. So it would have been a huge, huge encouragement for people to go back to work. And instead, Mnuchin went behind the president's back to Nancy Pelosi and other members of Congress and arranged a deal to not do that, but instead to give unemployment bonuses, where people not only got traditional unemployment benefits, but then on top of that received $600 a week. And what you ended up with was a situation where mostly people in leisure and hospitality, accommodations, food services, so think bartender, let's say, they were making more money sitting at home on unemployment than they could get working. And so even when people weren't afraid necessarily of getting COVID or dying of COVID, whatever the case may be, they still were choosing to sit at home and not go back to work because they were making more. I mean, this is insane. And then on top of that, we said, oh, by the way, we're not going to charge you federal income tax on those unemployment benefits. I mean, it became just an absolute green light for people to sit at home and not go back to work.
Absolutely, yeah. So during the recent election, Donald Trump has sort of pushed and talked a lot about tariffs, especially from imports. I'm interested, first of all, what role do tariffs have in the United States economy? What are tariffs and what do they do?
So tariffs are essentially taxes on international trade. And one of the things that, Cameron, for the life of me, I do not understand. So many of these economists who say they're free market economists, whatever that means. These days, I don't know anymore. But they talk about how they're for free trade. Why are you only for free international trade? What about free domestic trade? In other words, if you're going to be against a tariff, which is essentially a tax on international trade, right? Why are you supportive of domestic taxes like the income tax or a sales tax? Sales tax is exactly the same thing as a tariff, except it's on domestic trade instead of international trade. Same thing with the income tax, right? The income tax is a tax on my labor. I'm trading my labor for a paycheck.
Yeah.
Why are we okay with taxing that? Taxing domestic economic activity, but we're so rabidly against taxing international activity. On top of that, there's an increasing number of economists today, Cameron, who are talking about what's called a border adjustment tax, where we essentially look at things that are manufactured outside of this country, and we look at how are those being taxed differently than if they were made here. And oddly enough, we actually have a tax break, essentially. It's cheaper to pay taxes on things overseas being sold in this country than if you make them here and sell them here. It's exactly the opposite of what we want. That goes back to it's so difficult to make things here, to manufacture things here. It's a lot easier for companies to shift overseas. So I think tariffs should be treated no differently than any other kind of taxes. In fact, if you think about it from the standpoint of would you rather support your fellow Americans or would you rather support someone overseas? I think we should side with our fellow Americans. I would much rather rely on tariffs than on things like income taxes or sales taxes domestically. And look, it's not that we hate foreigners, we just love Americans more.
Right. So, as you said, many economists highly disagree with it. And in fact, 16 Nobel Prize winning economists signed a letter back in June saying that, Trump's economic plan and especially the tariff plan would, quote, reignite inflation and cause, economic disrupt. What do you sort of think about that? And who is the eventual person or industry that has to pay the tariffs?
So we'll take the last part of that question first. It's what we like to call tax incidence. So as you said, who actually is going to pay this tariff, right?
Yeah.
Because even though a company might be the one writing the check to the IRS, who's actually bearing the burden of it?
Right.
Is that company simply going to raise their prices and now Americans have to pay more? So that company is really just a middleman.
Yeah.
The American consumer pays more to them and then they write that check to the IRS.
Right.
Well, what we saw under the first Trump administration, this partially had to do with how strategic they were in placing those tariffs, was the fact that about 81 cents of every dollar of tariff wasn't even paid for by Americans, it was paid for by the Chinese producers who essentially just ate the cost. Part of the reason they were able to do that is because they're so heavily subsidized by the Chinese government. So bizarrely, you ended up with a situation where Chinese taxpayers were paying taxes to the Chinese Communist Party, which was then using that money to give a subsidy to a producer who then was paying a tariff to the U.S. Treasury. So somehow you ended up with Chinese taxpayers paying the U.S. Treasury. In terms of those Nobel laureates, though, those are the same people who under the first Trump administration said we were going to have runaway inflation, and we didn't. Inflation was actually below the Federal Reserve's 2% target. The Fed was struggling to get inflation up to where they wanted it. They also said, when the Biden administration took office, that the trillions of dollars in excess spending was not going to cause inflation. So they've been wrong twice now, very, very clearly. And it's also interesting that they also are overwhelmingly Democrats and donate overwhelmingly to Democrats. And so at some point you have to wonder, is this ideologically driven or is it actually driven by facts and figures?
Right.
Like, what is your empirical evidence behind your claims? And to date, I haven't seen any from them.
Yeah. So speaking of inflation, you talked about it a little bit. A couple months ago in an interview, you said that the prices, this was I think 2 or 3 months ago, you said that prices, when it looked like they should have come back down, they didn't, and the inflation is much worse than it actually seems.
Was this on supply chains?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
So one of the things that we've heard a lot about is that inflation was caused by supply chain disruption, right? It had nothing to do with the government spending. Now the big line is, it's greedy corporations, right? Whatever corporate greed means. But with the supply chains, if supply chains were really the source of higher prices, then you would expect that not only would inflation stop when the supply chain disruptions were resolved, when things were back to normal, but you would actually expect not only inflation to stop, but the prices to come back down. So inflation is the rate of increase.
Okay.
It helps, I think, if you think of it as you're driving down the road, you're driving down the highway, you're going 55 miles an hour. That is your rate of increase.
Yeah.
The mile marker on the side of the road, that's your position. So as you go down the highway, you're going at a certain speed, that's the rate of inflation. The mile marker is the price. And as you keep going down the road, the price is going up and up and up. Imagine you slow down dramatically, you're only doing 25 now. Mm-hmm. That's your rate of increase. The mile marker is still going up. That's where we are today. But you would expect, again, if the cause of higher prices went away, the prices should come back down. They're not.
Right.
And in fact, supply chains today are actually better lubricated. In other words, there's more excess capacity today than there was before the pandemic. So we're in even better shape, and yet prices still aren't coming down. They're continuing to go up. On the corporate greed idea, interestingly, the Biden administration publishes data not only on prices that you and I are paying, that consumers pay, but also on the prices that businesses pay. And both have risen exactly 20% over the course of this administration. In other words, businesses have simply passed on to consumers their higher cost of doing business. That's all we've seen.
Yeah.
And it's because inflation is a hidden tax. It's a tax that you and I pay, that consumers pay. It's also a tax that businesses pay.
So you talk about inflation, and I'm assuming, you were saying that inflation is, the rate at which it's increasing, so it can be slowed down. But once prices eventually start to come down, is that considered deflation?
If prices are coming down, yes, we would call that deflation. And you'll see that in localized pockets, right? You've seen that in oil markets, for example, right? Oil was $100 a barrel in the summer of 2022 and has since come down.
Yeah.
So you can say that is technically deflation in the sense that prices have come down. In the sense of a monetary phenomenon, though, in other words, are these lower prices being driven by a stronger dollar? The answer there is no, because you should be seeing a much broader decrease in prices. But we're seeing exactly the opposite. We're seeing a very broad increase.
Okay. All right, I want to shift focus a little bit. So, Project 2025. It's a big deal, very controversial subject. You, in fact, are listed as an author and contributor on the Project 2025 website.
As a contributor, I believe.
Contributor, yeah. Sorry about, yeah, okay. So, can you tell us a little bit, about it, what it is,
Sure.
and give a little background?
Sure. As far as my contribution to it, it was admittedly limited. Essentially, I had written a couple of pieces explaining here is how much less a family can buy today versus when the Biden administration took office. And so that was quoted in a number of places. It was quoted, obviously, in Project 2025, Fox News, Daily Caller, Wall Street Journal. I think the Trump campaign actually even used it at one point, too. So, again, I have an admittedly limited contribution to the project. As far as what it is, it's basically a repeat of what the Heritage Foundation has published during each presidential campaign, which is more or less a blueprint for conservative leadership. And maybe Cameron, blueprint isn't the best word for it, because there's actually conflicting opinions within the document. You might say it's a menu of options.
Yeah.
So, in a certain policy area, let's say, it will present a list of options that I would say can broadly be considered to be under that conservative umbrella. One of the things that has really fascinated me about this political cycle has been the amount of attention it got. And not only that, but the fact that people thought so many things were in it that weren't, or vice versa. They thought things weren't in it that were. For the life of me, I don't understand how it's possible, simply because the entire thing is online, and literally anyone can access it and hit Control F and look up a topic. So it's been very, very odd how much attention it has garnered, and also the misnomers around it.
Okay. Yeah. So to speak a little bit more specifically about it, I did the Control F, method, and I went through and looked at the tax plan. So the tax plan, favors, wealthier individuals more than the middle and working class.
How so? Can you give me an example?
Of the tax, it says the second term, we expect to see a $6,000 increase in taxes for the middle 20% of classes, and then for the top 0.1%, we're going to see a $2 million tax cut, and that is according to a couple of economists that have read the Project 2025 tax plan, and that's their takeaway from it.
Well, I would love to know which plan specifically, because there's really, again, as I said, it's really a menu. There's no single plan in there. If it's talking about extending the Trump tax cuts, one of the things, and actually I really shouldn't even call it a tax cut, it was really a tax reform, and I'll explain why. You did have all the brackets receive rate reductions, but you also had limitations on certain deductions and certain increases in others. SALT is a very good example of this, the state and local tax deduction. So what they did is they capped state and local tax deductions at $10,000. Previously it was unlimited. So interestingly, if you let the Trump tax reform expire, which is what a lot of people in the House of Representatives want to do, what would happen is lower and middle income Americans would actually see a tax increase because their rates would go up. And although rates would go up on the highest income bracket, the issue is that they would get so much back in that state and local tax deduction if they're in a high tax state like New York, Illinois, California, New Jersey, that they would actually see a reduction in their federal tax liability. And so we have to be very, very careful when we're doing these types of analyses that we're not only looking at one aspect of a change to the tax code, but that we're taking a more comprehensive view of it.
So do you think that the wealthier, top 0.1% is going to see a deduction in their taxes, and is the middle class and, lower class going to see an increase or a decrease in their taxes from what you expect?
One thing that we have to remember in terms of the wealthy paying more in taxes is that they don't. Right? We have this fictional notion that if you increase a tax rate, you will get a corresponding increase in tax revenue, and that's just not the case. We've seen this under Republicans and Democrats, right? We saw this probably most famously in the 1920s, when Andrew Mellon, the Treasury Secretary at the time, he referred to it as scientific taxation. Today, probably better described by the Laffer curve. But essentially what they found is we can actually reduce the tax rate on wealthy individuals, and because they will increase their economic activity and generate more income, they end up paying more in taxes under the lower rate than they would under the higher rate. JFK repeated the experiment and got exactly the same results, as did Ronald Reagan. You didn't see quite the same effects, I think, under George W. Bush, but that's because it wasn't the same kind of tax reform. It wasn't that same kind of broad relief. But you saw it again under the Trump tax reform, when they did essentially exactly the same thing as Reagan, as JFK, as both Harding and Coolidge in the 1920s, and they got the same result. The amount of taxes paid by the wealthy didn't go down, it went up, even though they were paying a lower rate.
To end it off, I'm just going to ask, what advice do you have for, people that are either maybe interested in economics or young people that are just kicking off their career, basically? Any advice to them?
I would say the biggest piece of advice, most broadly, is work insanely hard. And if you're not tired all day long, you're not working hard enough, right? If you have time to hang out with your friends, go see a movie, listen to music, relax, you're not working hard enough. I know that sounds extreme, I know that sounds crazy, but believe me, 5, 10, 15, 20 years down the road, you will be so grateful that you were the only one in your friends group or the people you knew, whatever the case may be, who was willing to put in that kind of work, because hard work wins at the end of the day. In terms of economics, ask yourselves, are you really kind of in a certain way obsessed with efficiency in all aspects of your life? Are you always looking for ways to do things better, to make things better? That's really what economics is all about. It's trying to address the fundamental problem of scarcity, that we as a human race have unlimited wants and needs and a limited amount of resources with which to try to fulfill those. And the question is, how do we allocate those as efficiently as possible? If that's the kind of thing that you find appealing, I would say go for it.
Very good.
If you're in it for the money, I would say probably not so much. You can probably do better in a field like finance, and you could do better in a field like petroleum engineering, right? Yeah. You can do very well in a field like that. But again, if you really have a mindset focused on efficiency, it might be something to pursue.
Perfect. Yeah. All right. Well, thank you very much for your time. It was, a pleasure getting to be able to talk to you, get some of your knowledge. You have very, very much of it. And I'm very interested in to get to listen to your speech, get to hear what you have to say.
Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Pleasure.